In today's video, we're going to be talking all about shooting and editing interior photography. We'll be discussing how to get great shots of rooms, what gear you need, and how to adjust all of those images to get a professional look. Now there are tons of different ways to shoot interior photography. You could use flash, you could use constant lights, you can use natural light, which is my favorite, and it kind of depends on who you're shooting for and who the client is. When I shoot a room, I like to use all natural window light. I'll shoot multiple exposures, usually 3. I'll blend those in post, or I'll just kind of choose one image and edit that. I'll let the windows blow out and kind of be either white or kind of have that hazy look because that's my personal preference. And the reason why I like to do this is oftentimes when you're shooting a home for listings or for a real estate agent, what's outside the windows isn't normally that appealing. There's another house next door out the window, or a street, or there's a bunch of cars in the road. I like to kind of blow those windows out, focus on what's on the inside. Sometimes you're gonna want to see what's outside. If the home that you're shooting has a view that the realtor wants featured, if it's important to see how the outside of the house interacts with the inside of the house, then you're probably gonna wanna shoot with constants or with flash, or you're gonna wanna do HDR photography where you shoot multiple exposures and blend those in post so you can see both inside and outside. Now, over the past couple of weeks, we've been releasing our new home renovation series. Link up here if you wanna check it out. So I thought I'd show you how I shoot our space for our blog and for Instagram. We're gonna be letting the windows blow out here. We're not gonna be talking about flash photography today. When I shoot a room, I want that room to look as close to what the eye sees as possible. So we're using natural light. We're not gonna over edit the photos. We want them to have a natural feel. An overcast day is typically the best for shooting interior photography. When it's sunny out, a lot of times that sun streams in through the windows and leaves really harsh highlights on furniture and the floor. And that can be really difficult to shoot. So oftentimes when I'm shooting real estate for a living, we would pick overcast days to shoot the interiors and sunny days with blue skies to shoot the exteriors. Before we get into actually how to do this, we need to talk about gear first. And the kit for shooting interior photography is very small, and you can really get away with one camera, 2 lenses, and a tripod for this. I like to use a full frame camera like the Sony a7R IV with a 16-35 lens. Now, it doesn't matter if that lens is 2.8 or f4, because if you're shooting interiors, you're gonna be shooting at f8, f11, so it's not going to matter how fast that lens is. You're gonna be sticking that camera on a tripod. This is a rectilinear lens, so you're not gonna have that distorted fisheye look. It's a nice wide lens without too much distortion, and any distortion that the lens might have is easily correctable in post. If you are shooting APS-C or on a crop body camera, then the equivalent to this is a 10 to 18 millimeter lens or a 10 to 22 millimeter lens, and that's gonna give you the same field of view. So a camera and a wide angle lens, that's gonna be your main shooter for those wide shots. But I also like to take a 50 millimeter lens there as well for those nice detail shots. My go-to lens for shooting detail shots is the 50 millimeter 1.4. This is a great normal looking lens, which is perfect for those nice shallow depth of field detail shots. And the depth of field of this lens is going to allow you to focus on details in the room while creaming out any distracting backgrounds. Equivalent lens for APS-C cameras would be 35 millimeters. For the 50 millimeter lens, I'm opting for a 1.4 or a 2.8 version so we can get that shallow depth of field, and that sets it apart from that wide angle total depth of field look that we get with the 16 millimeter. So we've got our camera, we've got our wide lens, and we got our normal looking 50 millimeter lens. You're also gonna need a tripod for this. When we're shooting those wide room shots, we're shooting at f8 or f11, and we want our ISO to be as low as possible to get the cleanest shot possible. When you're locked into a specific f-stop and ISO, then your shutter speed is gonna be what's changing, and oftentimes that means it's gonna be lower than what's acceptable for a handheld shot. Now we're also gonna be shooting multiple exposures as well, so that's another plus for the tripod. So you're gonna wanna put your camera on the tripod, adjust your shutter speed accordingly, let the long exposures happen, and let the multiple exposures happen. Now you're probably gonna be shooting those detail shots with the 50 millimeter lens or that 35 millimeter lens handheld, but the wide shots at 16 millimeters, those are gonna be on a tripod. My favorite tripod is the Peak Design tripod, but if you're looking for a nice tripod that's a little bit more of an affordable price, then the ProMaster X C-M modular tripod title is a decent option that's compact and easy to travel with. Before you can even start shooting, we're gonna wanna make sure that our camera is set to RAW, because when it comes to interior photography and shooting multiple exposures, pulling down highlights in post or popping up shadows, editing shots, we wanna have the most dynamic range as possible. So we're gonna wanna shoot RAW to give us the most options. Before you start shooting, you're gonna wanna have a look around the room to make sure that things are tidy. Fix up any sloppy pillows, wipe off the dust, declutter that coffee table, and for the love of God, please close the toilet seat. Nobody needs to see down there. When shooting a room like this, I like to get a variety of shots. We're gonna wanna get those nice wide shots from the most appealing corner of the room. But I also like to get these straight on shots, which I call a flat angle, which is just a straight on shot at something. Usually this works really well for a kitchen or for shelving or for a countertop area. And then we're gonna wanna add a lot of detail shots as well. And typically if you're working with an interior designer, there are probably gonna be these little moments in the room that are staged up, which are gonna be a magnet for your camera. You're gonna wanna shoot them. That's where your 50mm lens is gonna come into play. And as I mentioned earlier, all of those wide shots, we're gonna be shooting at f8 or f11, and we're gonna have those on a tripod. All of the detail shots, we're gonna be shooting handheld, and we're gonna be shooting those around 1.4 or 2.8, which will allow us to hopefully pull an appropriate shutter speed for a handheld shot, but don't be afraid to toss that camera on a tripod if the room is feeling a little bit dark. So when you're setting up your tripod shots, there are a couple of things you need to keep in mind. If your vertical and horizontal lines are kind of off or skewed, that's called keystoning, and that's kind of a telltale look of an amateur shot. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you get those vertical and horizontal lines as straight as possible in the camera, and then when you bring them into Lightroom, you can adjust them a little bit using the auto align feature, or if it's a little bit more complex than what Lightroom can handle, you can bring that right into Photoshop and use the perspective or distort tool to fix it. And I like to pull over guides to all my vertical and horizontal lines here so I can be sure that those lines are indeed straight. Your tripod height is gonna kind of depend on the room that you're shooting and how tall that ceiling is. I like to start at chest height and then move down or up depending on the room. You don't wanna get too low where you're shooting at the legs of the furniture, but you also don't wanna be so high where you have tons of ceiling in the shot. And you're gonna have to judge that in the back of your camera when you get into the space, depending on how the room is laid out, the height of the furniture, and how high that ceiling is. With those wide room shots, we're gonna try to get as much in focus as possible. So we're gonna be shooting those at f8 or f11. We want those shots to be nice and clear from the front to the back. So f8, f11 should do the trick. And then when we shoot those detail shots, we're gonna be shooting between f1.4 and f2.8. And we're gonna wanna have that creamy depth of field to set those shots apart from those wide shots with total depth of field. Shooting your wide shots at f8 and your detail shots with a shallow depth of field is also gonna give you a nice dynamic set of images. As I mentioned earlier, when I shoot a room, I use natural light, and I like to shoot bracketed 3 exposures. So a shot that's exposed properly for the midtones, one for the highlights, and then one for the shadows. Then later in post, I can either choose to blend those images together to get an HDR image, or I can choose one exposure and tweak that from there. Now with cameras like the A7R4, the dynamic range is so good that if I overexpose by a stop or two, I can actually bring that down in post and get a perfectly exposed image, assuming that we don't have that bright sun outside. And this usually gives me the best results, but I still tend to shoot those extra images just as a safety net in case I have a part of a room that's too dark or too bright that I need to blend in, or if I need to see outside and see the inside, then I have the ability to blend those exposures. So when you're shooting multiple exposures, you can actually set this right up in your camera depending on if your camera is compatible with this. You just set your exposure, take 3 consecutive shots, and it will change the exposure for you. And when you're doing this, you're probably gonna wanna make sure that you're on manual focus so that during those 3 shots, your focus point stays exactly the same. When capturing a room, you wanna try to get a number of compositions so that you have a nice dynamic set of images. If you're shooting for a realtor, just the wide shots are probably gonna be good enough just to show the room. But if you're shooting for an interior designer, you're probably gonna wanna shoot a number of different types of shots. We're gonna want those wide shots. So usually for those, I'm gonna pick the most attractive corner in the room and shoot into a corner. Then I'm gonna shoot those flat angle shots that I was talking about earlier. If there's like tile work, kitchen, countertop, artwork, fireplace, those lend themselves really well to flat shots. We have that wide lens that ranges from 16 to 35 on as well. So don't be afraid to zoom in a little bit and get those mid shots. Sometimes it's nice to have something that's not super wide and not super tight like that 50mm is gonna give us. We do our wide shots, our angle shots, our flat shots. We're gonna move into our detail shots. And I'm thinking about flat lays here, kind of product style images, maybe stuff that has a lot of white space on top. And once we get all of those images in the bank, we're sure we got our room shots, we got our detail shots, we can start to get a little bit artsy by shooting some dirty frame images, or maybe doing something really different by getting low or getting really high and shooting a really angled image, or maybe even shooting through a mirror. Talked about keystoning, keeping those verticals and horizontals straight, but if you're shooting a more artsy shot where your shot is specifically you know, tilted up or tilted down and you have those really exaggerated angles, then that can actually work. Now, a realtor might not like this, but a designer or an architect might like this. So don't be afraid to shoot up or down and break those rules on your last couple of shots once you have the other ones in the bag. When it comes to editing my interior shots, I try to keep them as neutral as possible. And a lot of times for Instagram, we're kind of editing pretty heavily into a style. So I want to try to make sure that those room shots are actually looking fairly natural. So for blending exposures, we want to be really careful that we're not getting any weird halos or we have that unnatural HDR look. Less is more when it comes to blending exposures. And if you're using the clarity tool, don't go too heavy-handed with it. Oftentimes the clarity tool can add these really weird halos and make the shot look unnatural. Sometimes you might come across a room that has a large window on one side and not a lot of windows on the other. And if you only have one exposure, you can use tools in Lightroom to selectively adjust the exposure of certain parts of the image. So sometimes I can add a local adjustment brush to a shadow and just pop up the exposure. Now you're gonna wanna make sure that when you shoot all of these images, you are shooting raw so you have the most flexibility in post as possible. So that is basically all of my tips and tricks for shooting interior photography. I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you haven't been watching the Home Reno series, check it out, link up here. Thank you so much for watching and we'll catch you on the next one. Check. Oh, I should make sure that I don't have cheesies and boogers on my nose. A few pimps, but that's it. That's all you can do. Roll off, baby.